Imagine, if you will, a world that's less Little House on the Prairie and more Keeping Up with the Olympians. It's a divine soap opera where gods are not just living among mortals, but swiping right on them as well. Their offspring, known as Nephilim, giants or heroes of renown, at least the original influencers, are considered demigods, while later Jewish and Christian literature, like Enoch, give these figures a thumbs down. Genesis doesn't bat an eyelid. If we follow Russell Gmirkin's theory that Genesis is not just playing footsie with Plato, but full-on flirting, then we see a plot twist. The divine DNA of these demigods is diluted by human vices, desires, and wickedness, triggering a flood. In other words, the problem wasn't the sons of God, but the mortal humans who couldn't keep their wicked passions in check. This is akin to the pride of the Atlanteans causing Zeus to flood them. Meanwhile, the Mesopotamian gods, in a fit of celestial NIMBYism, flood the world because humans were too noisy. Talk about a divine noise complaint. We've been untangling this peculiar genealogy in Genesis 2:4, where the generations of heaven and earth, or Ouranos and Gaia, mirror the Greek myths where heaven and earth are actual gods of the ultimate demiurge. This theme of divine genealogies is a recurring motif in Genesis, including the Table of Nations in Genesis 10. But how does one trace the lineage of heaven and earth? If we look at Hesiod's Theogony or Plato's works, it's clear these were actual gods who reproduced to create other gods. Genesis presents a curious blend of human lineage and divine beings, or gods, who intermingle their seed with humans. After the flood wipes out all but 8 people, we see a list of Noah's descendants. And who do we find in this list? In the Septuagint version of Genesis 10, we encounter a character named Nimrod. Now there's a name that's begging for a backstory.
And Chus begat Nimrod. He began to be a giant upon the earth. He was a giant hunter before the Lord God. Therefore they say, as Nimrod, the giant hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babylon, Orek, and Arkad, and Chalan, and the land of Shinar.
Picture this: Nimrod, a giant, a titan of sorts in the Greek version of Genesis. Quite the spectacle, isn't it? Contrary to the bad rap he gets in Enoch and other biblical texts, Genesis paints him as a pretty decent chap. He's before the Lord, which is a far cry from Cain, who's more of a run from the Lord kind of guy. It seems these semi-divine figures didn't just vanish post-flood. They're right there in Genesis, hanging out with the rest of us mortals. Genesis 10 presents us with a list of 70 nations, a mythological census of sorts, explaining the divisions of peoples, languages, and beliefs. Each nation was under the jurisdiction of a god, and Genesis doesn't seem to have a problem with this divine delegation. It's only in later books like Exodus that Yahweh starts picking fights with the gods of other nations, like the deities of Egypt. But in Genesis, it's all peace and love among the gods. It's as if they're all chilling at a celestial cocktail party. Why didn't Abraham's God pick a fight with the Egyptian deities? Maybe he didn't want to spill his divine martini. Russell Gmirkin suggests a similar scenario in Greek narratives, but what happened to the sons of God from Genesis 6? Did they retire to a divine villa on Mount Olympus? Here's a thought. Genesis 10 mentions 70 nations. Enoch talks about 70 angels ruling 70 nations with 70 different tongues. This brings to mind Paul's letters about speaking in tongues of angels. But let's be clear, an angel is a god. Only those clinging to the cliff of absolute monotheism would argue otherwise. The phrase, "let us make man in our image," should give pause to any apologists. It's polytheism, plain and simple. Some try to rebrand Genesis as henotheism, which is fine, but it doesn't erase the existence of other gods in this narrative. The 70 nations, tongues, angels, or gods, if we're being honest, correlate to the 70 sons of the supreme deity El, in Ugaritic Canaanite mythology. Is Genesis painting a picture of a polytheistic world where gods rule over various nations, tribes, tongues, and regions? Would the Son of God, Yahweh, also ruling over one land, people, tongue? It seems so. And Deuteronomy 32, 8-9 spills the beans.
When the Most High, Elyon, gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's, Yahweh's, portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage.
In the grand pantheon of Genesis, Yahweh is the head honcho, the big cheese, the top dog among the gods. But let's not get carried away here. He's not the ultimate creator god, the demiurge, the divine craftsman. It's a bit like Zeus, who while being the CEO of terrestrial gods, didn't actually build the place. Now if you're still with me, let's take a detour to Psalms 82. Here we find the chief deity El not just presiding over a board meeting of gods, but actually passing judgment on them. It's a divine courtroom drama, a celestial Judge Judy episode, if you will. The admission of this polytheistic world is as clear as a supernova in a night sky. So let's dive into the divine council of Psalms 82.
God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked, Selah? Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I say, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, you shall die like men and fall like any prince. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for to thee belong all the nations.
Without a solid grasp of this celestial soap opera, I fear we'll be left floundering in the cosmic dust when it comes to the Table of Nations and Tower of Babel narrative. So buckle up, dear viewer, as we embark on a journey to the Tower of Babel, potentially a creative spin-off from the ruins of a Babylonian ziggurat and a mythology fan fiction of the highest order. We'll delve into the Table of Nations and the Tower of Babel, which might just be the late bloomers of biblical narratives. And by late, I don't mean they missed the bus by a few minutes. We're talking Hellenistic period late. Some scholars might coyly suggest a post-exile Persian period, but do they have the audacity to venture into the Hellenistic era? Enter stage right, Russell Gmirkin, who isn't afraid to push the chronological envelope. Stay tuned to find out why. ascending to heaven. Picture this: a city named Babel, a name that echoes through the corridors of biblical history. This isn't just any city, though. It's a city that was stopped dead in its tracks by a divine holdup. Now, this story, often dubbed the Tower of Babel saga, isn't just about a tower, which could have been a fortress or more likely a temple. No, it's about an entire city. The plot thickens when humanity, all speaking the same language, decide to huddle up in one place, Shinar. Here they roll up their sleeves and embark on a project of epic proportions, building a city that would etch their names into the annals of time and keep them from scattering. But plot twists. Their grand plans are foiled by Yahweh and his divine squad, who, taken aback by their audacity, throw a linguistic wrench in their plans and scatter them across the globe. This divine mic drop gives birth to the name Babel, which sounds suspiciously like the Hebrew word for confuse. Now, the origins and inspiration of this story have sparked some heated scholarly debates. While there's a general agreement that the story is part of the Yahwist J source, the consensus ends there. Some scholars suggest that the Yahwist inherited a unified tradition, or at least one that had been blended from multiple sources during oral transmission. Others, however, argue that the Yahwist was the master chef who cooked up this narrative stew. Who was this Yahwist, you ask? Well, in J's writings, Yahweh is portrayed as an anthropomorphic figure, both physically and mentally. For example, when Abraham haggles with Yahweh over the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah, or when Yahweh, ticked off by the Israelites' lack of faith, threatens to wipe them out and start fresh with Moses' descendants. But when Moses steps in, Yahweh changes his mind. The dating of J's writings has been a hot topic among scholars. Julius Wellhausen, a 19th century German scholar, didn't try to date J more precisely than the monarchical period of Israel's history. In 1938, Gerhard von Rad placed J at the court of Solomon around 950 BCE, arguing that his purpose in writing was to justify the unified state created by Solomon's father, David. This was generally accepted until a crucial 1976 study by H. Schmid, the so-called Yahwist, argued that J knew the prophetic books of the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. While the prophets did not know the traditions of the Torah, meaning J could not be earlier than the 7th century, a minority of scholars place J even later, in the exilic and or post-exilic period, 6th to 5th centuries BCE. Then there are those who really like pushing the boundaries into the Hellenistic period, like Russell Gmirkin. Those who advocate for the amalgamation of discrete traditions point to the separate motifs of dispersion, the construction of a tower to storm the heavens, and the confusion of tongues found in extra-biblical sources. These motifs, in their original form, either underscored a significant etiology, such as why humanity speaks more than one language, or conveyed a profound religious teaching, such as the peril of encroaching upon the divine realm. Some scholars suggest that the inspiration of the Babel story was drawn from actual temple ruins in Mesopotamia. They propose that the tower refers to the ziggurat architectural form, a pyramid-like structure with each successive layer smaller than the one below it, and possibly to the Intimanaki, the grand ziggurat temple of Babylon. Intimanaki in Sumerian is the temple of the foundation of heaven and earth, a ziggurat dedicated to the Mesopotamian god Marduk in the ancient city of Babylon. It now exists only in ruins, located about 56 miles south of Baghdad, Iraq. However, given the story's overtly anti-Babylonian stance, a Mesopotamian origin seems unlikely unless it was penned by a citizen of a Mesopotamian city rivaling Babylon. Finally, within the Christian canon, the account of Pentecost in Acts 2, 5-13 may be understood as a New Testament version of God's gracious reversal of the Babel condition. At Babel, God transformed a single language into many, creating confusion. At Jerusalem, the Holy Spirit made it possible for many languages to be understood as one, creating unity. At Babel, language was used to promote a human agenda. At Jerusalem, the new language was used to announce the mighty works of God. At Babel, God scattered the people in judgment. At Jerusalem, God scattered the people to spread the news, which would eventually result in worldwide unity. Mythical Origins. The Tower of Babel, a scholarly tale unraveled by Russell Gmirkin. Let's hit the pause button on our usual understanding of the Babylonian structures as depicted in Genesis 11, 1-9, and instead let's dive into the complex backstory of the Tower of Babel narrative. Genesis 11, 1-5 paints a picture of the birth of Babylon and the construction of its tower by the survivors of the flood. The narrative suggests that the remnants of humanity journeyed east to Shinar, laying the foundation for the first post-flood city, Babylon. The focus in Genesis 11 is on the city's construction as a whole, not merely the tower. Thus, Genesis 11, 1-4 primarily narrates the birth of Babylon, with the erection of a temple tower as a sanctuary facet. This tradition of Babylon being the first city post-flood could hardly have originated anywhere but Babylon itself. However, the narrative is not purely Babylonian. It's important to first identify which story elements originated from the underlying Babylonian source and which were innovative additions by the author of Genesis 11, 1-9. The confusion of languages and the scattering of humanity post-flood from Babylon are themes absent in Mesopotamian sources. The biblical claim that the city was named Babel, since Yahweh confused the languages of the earth, contains a pun that only works in Hebrew. This pun, with its anti-Babylonian bias, may have been a polemical response to Mesopotamian traditions linking Babel to Babilu, gate of God, or associating Babel with Bel, that is Marduk. Yahweh's objection to the godlike aspirations of Babylon's builders also had anti-Babylonian overtones and continued a non-Mesopotamian theme against hubris found elsewhere in early Genesis. The division of humanity resulting from their scattering from Babylon reflected the interests of the final author, as illustrated by the Table of Nations in Genesis 10, and must also be considered as secondary addition. For these reasons, the theme regarding the confusion of languages and the resulting scattering of humanity must be seen as an innovation of the author of Genesis 11, 1-9, not derived from a Mesopotamian source. Subtracting these elements from the account at Genesis 11, 5-9, the remaining material recounts the founding of Babylon by the survivors of the flood and the scattering of post-flood Babylonians, which halted the city's construction. The story appears to have originally described a local cataclysm that befell Babylon, its residents, and its buildings after the first catastrophe of the flood. This likely began as a local legend relating to the site of Babylon and may represent an etiology on ruins at Babylon in later times. The precise nature of this second catastrophe cannot be ascertained from Genesis 11 alone. The Mesopotamian source of the Tower of Babel's story appears to have been the Poem of Erra. which describe both the flood and a later destruction of Babylon in a second catastrophe of comparable severity. The Poem of Erra was a popular work, enjoying even wider circulation in the first millennium BCE than the Gilgamesh epic. The poem must have been central to Babylonian culture. At least 36 copies have been recovered from 5 first millennium sites: Ashur, Babylon, Nineveh, Sultan Tepe, and more even, as the Assyriologist and historian of religions Luigi Giovanni Cagni points out, than have been recovered of the Epic of Gilgamesh according to this poem. The flood occurred when Marduk, lord of the gods, was angered at humankind and rose from his royal throne. A cosmic catastrophe ensued, affecting both heaven and earth, and floodwaters destroyed most of humankind as well as the city of Babylon. Marduk himself was drenched and his royal attire darkened and ruined. Marduk rebuilt his house, his temple at Babylon, and returned to his temple throne. But his government was inadequate due to the condition of his royal garments. The Apkallu sages, who alone were competent to create a new splendid idol of Marduk for the temple, had been sent to the underworld. Marduk therefore planned to leave his throne again, to descend to the underworld to have his royal attire restored, despite the second catastrophe that would inevitably ensue. In his absence, the world would be ruled by Erra, the Mesopotamian god of destruction. Waters again would rise, a storm would blot out the sky, and an evil wind would blow. The remnant of humankind, who survived the first flood, would be threatened with extinction. Cities would be destroyed and temples laid waste. Babylon would fall, as well as other Babylonian cities, even Sippar, which alone had been spared from the earlier deluge. The ziggurat of the sanctuary of Babylon, the city walls, and towers would all be destroyed. But finally the wrath of Erra would be placated. Marduk would be allowed to return to his temple, which, however, Erra still presided over. The gods would be reconciled and returned to their proper places, and order would be restored. Babylonia would rise again, and Babylon would be rebuilt, although at the direction of a curiously benevolent Erra, god of destruction, not Marduk as one would expect. The ruined temples would again raise their heads as high as the flaming sun. The Poem of Erra provides the closest Mesopotamian parallel to the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. It had Babylon repopulated by the remnant of humankind who survived the flood. It described a second catastrophe that befell the residents of Babylon in the post-flood era. It contained an explicit image of the ziggurat and the city walls and fortifications of Babylon in ruins. The Poem of Erra indeed contained the first cuneiform reference to the ziggurat in Menaki at Babylon. Can you see the comparison to what's happening here in this poem and what we see in the Tower of Babel story? Most scholars don't know or can't find a mythical or legendary antecedent to the story, but Russell Gmirkin, I think, has found it. Seeking the source. It may be independently established that Berossus drew on the Poem of Erra as a source, or a tradition very similar to it. Among cuneiform sources, the Poem of Erra uniquely alluded to a tradition that the ancient city of Sippar survived the first deluge. In Berossus, Xisuthros buried tablets containing ancient lore, notably astrological records, at Sippar prior to the flood, and the flood survivors retrieved the tablets afterwards. This suggests that Berossus was familiar with the literary traditions related to the Poem of Erra. Evidence that Berossus recorded the Mesopotamian version of the Tower of Babel story is indirectly provided by Pseudo-Eupolemus, which drew on Berossus. Pseudo-Eupolemus was a Samaritan Jewish author of circa 250 BCE who wrote a history of the world down to the time of Abraham, loosely based on Genesis, but with an emphasis on the transmission of astrological lore. The writings of Pseudo-Eupolemus, like those of Berossus, were preserved in excerpt by Alexander Polyhistor and subsequently passed on by Eusebius. In one fragment, Pseudo-Eupolemus wrote,
"In anonymous works, we find that Abraham traced his ancestry to the giants. These dwelt in the land of Babylonia. Because of their impiety, they were destroyed by the gods. One of them, Belos, escaped death and settled in Babylon. He built a tower and lived in it. The tower was called Belos, after its builder."
A second text recorded a slightly different, or rather complementary, account. Eupolemus, in his work On the Jews, states that the Assyrian city of Babylon was first founded by those who escaped the flood. When the tower was destroyed by God's power, these giants were scattered over the whole earth. These two fragments combine to tell the following story. The giants, including Belus, which is Bel Marduk, originally lived in Babylonia. Due to their impiety, the gods destroyed them, presumably by the flood. Belos survived the flood and founded Babylon and its tower. The Tower of Babel was named after Belos. After a second act of impiety, the gods destroyed the tower and the giants were scattered across the whole earth. A passage in the Sibylline Oracle, widely recognized as dependent on Pseudo-Eupolemus, adds another detail. The tower was cast down by a great wind sent from heaven. This account has many features in common with Berossus and with Genesis 11, 1-9. All three describe Babylon as founded or refounded by survivors of the flood. Additionally, Pseudo-Eupolemus contained an account of the destruction of the Tower of Babel and the scattering of the giants across the earth, linking up more directly with Genesis. Several aspects of the story in Pseudo-Eupolemus point to a Mesopotamian source, independent of Genesis. The description of Belos as a giant may have been based in part on the enormous representations of Bel Marduk at Babylon. Enuma Elish, which described Marduk's gigantic stature, provides another parallel. Several Mesopotamian sources portrayed Bel as the founder of Babylon, notably Enuma Elish, Berossus, and the Poem of Erra. Bel as the king ruling Babylon from his temple throne was another common Mesopotamian conception. Bel Marduk was the protagonist in several Mesopotamian literary works. In the Marduk prophecy, the abduction of the statue of Marduk by the Hittites was transformed into a tale in which Marduk, king of Babylon, took a journey to the west and returned. In the Marduk ordeal, the capture of Marduk's statue by Sennacherib was transformed into a tale of Marduk's imprisonment and interrogation for suspicion of rebellion against Assur, Assyrian lord of the gods. The Poem of Erra, in close analogy to Pseudo-Eupolemus, recounted misfortunes befalling Bel Marduk. The mortality of the gods, giants, in Pseudo-Eupolemus has parallels in Mesopotamian literature such as Enuma Elish, in which the gods Apsu and Tiamat and a number of primordial monsters were slain, and in which humans were created from the blood of a beheaded god. These are all indications of an authentic Mesopotamian source behind Pseudo-Eupolemus. Although Pseudo-Eupolemus incorporated a flood story, it was not the familiar deluge of the Atrahasis epic. Gilgamesh and Utnapishtim did not appear in Pseudo-Eupolemus, nor was the survival of a remnant of humankind a matter of significance. The ark did not even merit mention. In Pseudo-Eupolemus, the protagonists were the gods, and the survival of Bel Marduk, not humanity, was the notable event. The flood was not the exclusive focus of Pseudo-Eupolemus. The story continued through a second cataclysm that destroyed Babylon's tower. These details point to a source other than the standard Mesopotamian flood stories. Parallels between the Poem of Erra and the Tower of Babel story in Genesis have already been discussed. Numerous parallels also exist between the Poem of Erra and Pseudo-Eupolemus, pointing to a genetic relationship between the two. As in Pseudo-Eupolemus, Babylon was the main setting of the Poem of Erra, and the god Bel Marduk was the main protagonist. Both the Poem of Erra and Pseudo-Eupolemus presented Bel Marduk as building the temple at Babylon. This structure served as the palace from which he ruled the city after the flood. Both associated the departure of Bel Marduk from Babylon with a catastrophe that struck the city. In the Poem of Erra, human impiety was the reason for Bel Marduk's departure from Babylon and all the cosmic disorder that ensued, and specifically for the flood. Pseudo-Eupolemus also cited impiety of the residents of Babylonia as the cause of the flood. This detail, present in both the Poem of Erra and Pseudo-Eupolemus, was absent both in Genesis and in the Gilgamesh epic. Most significantly, in both of the Poem of Erra and the Pseudo-Eupolemus, Bel Marduk was himself a survivor of the flood. In Pseudo-Eupolemus, as in the Poem of Erra, Bel Marduk was pictured as driven from Babylon, his home, by other powerful gods who destroyed the Tower of Babel. In the Poem of Erra, Bel Marduk was the similar victim of a conspiracy led by Erra, god of destruction, who tricked him into leaving Babylon and in his absence staged a coup, took over the government of the universe and destroyed Babylon, its fortifications, and its ziggurat. Only in the Poem of Erra do we have a cuneiform example of Bel Marduk's exile and Babylon's fall resulting from a rivalry of the gods. Another parallel relates to the destruction of the Tower of Babel by a wind from the gods, as attested in Sibylline Oracles 397 through 109, which is widely acknowledged as having drawn on Pseudo-Eupolemus. The Poem of Erra also listed an evil wind as one of the agents of destruction in the catastrophe that followed Marduk's second departure from the throne. Finally, both Pseudo-Eupolemus and the Poem of Erra mentioned the fall of Babylon's ziggurat. Genesis omitted any mention of the fall of the Tower of Babel, stating only that the construction in Babylon ceased after its residents were scattered. All these pointed parallels demonstrate that Pseudo-Eupolemus was specifically indebted to the Poem of Erra. However, it seems incredible that Pseudo-Eupolemus, a Samaritan author of the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, would have had direct knowledge of the Poem of Erra in cuneiform. Rather, Pseudo-Eupolemus appears to have obtained his knowledge of the Poem of Erra by means of an intermediate source, presumably writing in Greek, since Pseudo-Eupolemus himself wrote in Greek and utilized the Septuagint and other Greek sources. Berossus is the most obvious and indeed the only known Greek source on Babylonian cuneiform traditions. Berossus. Opinion is divided over whether Pseudo-Eupolemus was dependent on Berossus's Babylonica. Wacholder, Walter, and Schneibel originally held that Pseudo-Eupolemus directly drew on Berossus. Schnabel later modified his views, concluding that Pseudo-Eupolemus drew on an oral tradition of Mesopotamian origin. Wacholder effectively rebutted this view, pointing out that such phrases as "some say," "the Babylonians say," and "called by the Greeks" demonstrated that the author made use of literary sources. Further, Wacholder pointed out the direct literary dependence of Pseudo-Eupolemus' tradition on Abraham as the Babylonian sage in the 10th generation after the flood, with a virtually identical tradition in Berossus, as quoted by Josephus. Hence, it appears certain that Pseudo-Eupolemus utilized Berossus, at least in part. Quanvig acknowledged that Pseudo-Eupolemus drew on Berossus. However, Quanvig pointed out that the flood story in Pseudo-Eupolemus had significant differences from the familiar version found in Berossus. In Pseudo-Eupolemus, the flood struck the giants, not humankind. The protagonist was the god Belos, not Kisithros. The reason for the catastrophe was impiety, whereas in Berossus, no reason was given. And Pseudo-Eupolemus connected the flood story with the Tower of Babel. Quanvig commented, "A Babylonian could hardly make Belos the supreme god of Babylon, the hero of the flood." Quanvig concluded that the account in Pseudo-Eupolemus drew on a Mesopotamian tradition distinct from Berossus. Quanvig did not suggest what that Mesopotamian source might be, maybe the Poem of Erra, or how Pseudo-Eupolemus might have obtained knowledge of it. Quanvig's arguments fail to find their mark insofar as they only demonstrate that the flood tradition in Pseudo-Eupolemus differs from that of the Gilgamesh epic Tablet 11 and the parallel account in Berossus. Quanvig failed to note the possibility that Berossus may have drawn on a different cuneiform tradition for the post-flood period. We have already seen that Berossus was aware of the tradition that Sippar survived the flood, uniquely paralleled among cuneiform sources in the Poem of Erra. It is possible that just as Berossus combined Enuma Elish, the Sumerian king list, and the Gilgamesh epic Tablet 11 to present a connected narrative of the world down to the flood, he likewise drew on the Poem of Erra to extend his account to the post-flood generations. In Berossus, the ark was of gigantic dimensions, suggesting that the flood survivors were giants in Berossus, as in Pseudo-Eupolemus. Quanvig's objections are thus satisfied by the observation that Berossus supplemented the Gilgamesh epic flood story with the Poem of Erra, in which the focus was Bel Marduk and the rivalry of the gods, not Kisithros and humanity. Important affinities exist between the Poem of Erra and the story of the Tower of Babel as found in Genesis and Pseudo-Eupolemus. The account of the Tower of Babel in Pseudo-Eupolemus appears to derive from the Poem of Erra by way of Berossus according to all available evidence. This supports the conclusion that the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis, which also has strong parallels with the Poem of Erra, likewise derived from Berossus. That the Tower of Babel story derived from the Poem of Erra already causes difficulties for the documentary hypothesis, given the Poem of Erra's late date, 680 to 669 BCE. It is worth noting that the Poem of Erra displayed no special interest or pride in Babylonian architecture, wonders, and construction techniques. It was only in Berossus that we encounter in a single document allusions to Babylon as the first post-flood city, to the burnt brick and bitumen architecture of Babylon, and to the Poem of Erra's account of the fall of Babylon. This unique blend of themes points to Berossus as the Mesopotamian source behind the Tower of Babylon story in Genesis. Table of Nations and Hellenistic roots. Finally, we come to the enigmatic world of Genesis 10, also known as the Table of Nations. This biblical tableau sketches a fascinating family tree, tracing the roots of various nations in the eastern Mediterranean back to Noah's 3 sons. But here's the catch. The table isn't an exhaustive list, and the principles guiding the categorization of descendants remain shrouded in mystery. The temporal placement of the table is another hotbed of scholarly contention. Another detail stretches credibility. Was every nation on earth really descended from a single ancestor? This last odd fact is probably the easiest to explain. As biblical scholars such as John Van Cedars have long known, the biblical authors got this directly from the Greeks, who gave virtually every nation known to them an eponymous ancestor. Herodotus is chock full of examples. For instance, the Hellenes or Greeks were all descended from Hellas, the Lydians from Lydis, the Persians from Persis, and so on. In one very striking parallel to the Table of Nations, the 3 main divisions of the Greeks, namely the Dorians, Aeolians, and Archaeans, were descended from the 3 sons of Hellas named Doris, Aeolus, and Xuthus, the Shem, Ham, and Japhet of the Greek world. Hellas, meanwhile, was the son of the flood hero Deucalion, the Greek version of Noah. But when, how, and why did the biblical authors come up with a Greek-style genealogy for the Table of Nations? According to Russell Gmirkin, clues can be found in the Table of Nations itself, which exactly mirrors the geopolitical contours of the Eastern Mediterranean around 273 to 272 BCE. First, let's take a look at Shem, Noah's oldest son. His sons are Elam, ancestor of the Elamites, and Ashur, ancestor of the Assyrians, and Aram, ancestor of Arameans, all well-known peoples of the ancient Mesopotamia, and Lud, the ancestor of the Lydians of Asia Minor? What? When was Lydia ever united with Mesopotamia? Certainly at no time before the conquest of Alexander the Great in 335 to 325 BCE. But afterwards, in the Hellenistic era, when the Jews would have known all about the Greeks and their genealogies of nations? Bingo! As it so happens, after 278 BCE, Lydia was a key territory within the Seleucid Empire, ruled from Babylon. Shem corresponds neatly with the Seleucids, one of the 2 major regional powers after the time of Alexander the Great. Let's take a look at Ham, Noah's 2nd son. Ham was a common name for Egypt. Ham's sons included Mizraim, another name for Egypt, and Cush or Ethiopia, and Put or Libya, and Canaan, which was under Egyptian control during the various periods of history. The descendants of Cush in the Table of Nations included locations along both Arabian and African coasts of the Red Sea. These coasts were explored and charted by the fleets of Ptolemy II Philadelphus in 278 BCE, and Ptolemy officially laid claim to the entire list of nations in 273 to 270 BCE. So Ham corresponds neatly with the Ptolemies, the other major regional power. Finally, we come to Japhet, the 3rd son of Noah, apparently named after the Greek titan Lepidus, one of those pesky giants who survived the flood. The territories assigned to Japhet, bordering Mesopotamia and Lydia to the north, correspond strikingly well with the territories of the former Persian Empire that Alexander failed to conquer. Also included was Javan, a reference to the Ionian Greeks. In other words, all the familiar nations known to the Jews of that time, not found in the warring Seleucid and Ptolemaic empires. Our exploration suggests that the Table of Nations could be a reflection of the geopolitical realities of the Eastern Mediterranean around 273 to 272 BCE. Conclusion. Well, folks, there you have it. We've scaled the Tower of Babel, navigated the polytheistic labyrinth, and dined at the Table of Nations, all while keeping our scholarly hats firmly on our heads. And let's not forget our late-night rendezvous with the biblical author, who, according to the ever-punctual Russell Gmirkin, probably wrote during the times Greeks took over the party. Be sure to secure a copy of his book in the description, and for various scholars mentioned in this video, I will put the sources to their names in the description. But don't you dare hit that unsubscribe button yet. We've only just begun to scratch the surface of this ancient enigma. Next up, we're setting our sights on the patriarch of all patriarchs, Abraham himself. And trust me, there's more to him than just a few begets and begettings. So keep your wits about you, maintain a healthy dose of skepticism, and remember, in the world of biblical scholarship, the late bird gets the worm. Or was it the early bird? Either way, stay tuned for more biblical deep dives where we'll continue to question everything except our sense of humor. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and tap the bell so you get notified every single time we launch an episode. Also, consider joining our family by becoming a MythVision patron or YouTube member. And until next time, keep those scrolls unrolling and never forget, we are MythVision.